Live at 6 o'clock.
We're live.
We're live. Okay, we're live. Right, take your hands out your pockets. Right, we're live. Welcome to everyone who's watching us on Periscope and who will be watching this on YouTube for the next week or so, no doubt. And the great thing about Health Chats is that I get to choose the guests, and I've been waiting to invite this guest to come and spend some time with us for ages now, and it's been difficult to get into his diary and all the rest of it because we go back a long way. We go back to when we both had hair, I think. Although I think
I think you still have.
Still a bit more, yeah. But we go back. So stop waving; it puts me off. Got to start again now. Good evening. Welcome to the King's Speech. It's very disruptive. But I go back to this guest who I've known for years, and I'm just really looking forward to spending some time with him and a bit of reminiscing and getting his opinions. And he's done some really interesting jobs as well, and we'll get into the work that he's doing now. But of course we can't have Health Chats, we can't do any of this without our sponsors, so thank you very much to IMS Maxims, the kings of open source. And it wouldn't be right to start an evening like this without at least 45 minutes of message from our sponsors. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael.
And it is indeed a pleasure to be able to introduce Neil. I started medicine in the late 70s. I'm being moved around the room too, as you can see. And that was almost in the Lancelot Sprat era. And I remember as a fairly junior surgeon ringing the consultant to say, you put something on my list and I can't do this. And he said, never mind, help will be at hand shortly. So I waited and waited. And his secretary arrived at the theatre door with the surgical textbook saying, all you have to do is read that. So that's the way that's the way it was then. So
And a lot better it was too.
see, that story was so good he's even stopped him whistling, which was good. So Neil has arrived at the point where he has supervised proper supervision and proper regulation, and that must be a very interesting journey, and I really look forward to hearing it.
Thank you very much. And before we start, have you got the picture? I just wanted to share the picture. Hang on, if we can find this. Yes. Okay, here it is. I thought you'd just like to see this. Our guest this evening, of course, is an accomplished bongo player. Can you see that there? Yes. That's him, and we playing the bongos at a conference. We can't quite remember when it was. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the best bongo player in the NHS, Niall Dickson. Do you know when that was? No, I can't remember when it was.
I assumed you pixelated it or something.
No, it's a real picture. Thanks very much. Well, Neil, welcome, and thank you very much for coming to talk to us. I don't know where to start, really. You've got such a fascinating career. Well, let's start at the beginning, because you were a teacher, I think.
I was. I taught at the comprehensive school for a couple of years. Yeah.
Really? What do you think of education these days?
Well, I think medical education is
No,
going
no,
through all
listen
sorts of
to me.
things. Education generally, I'm not really in touch with it. I think it's
Overregulated?
Overrated.
Well, possibly overrated. I think that, interesting enough, Ofsted has gone through a lot of some of the pains that CQC has also gone through as governments have tried to introduce forms of system regulation, changed their minds about what they wanted, then applied a different model, and then found that that didn't work, and so forth. I think overall, I suppose I'm not an expert on it, but I would think that Ofsted has probably been a force for good. If you remember what the culture was, and certainly when I was at school, I don't think that we really thought about the quality of teaching at all. People were just appointed and you were left alone in your classroom to do whatever you were doing. And I think now the best form of regulation, whether in schools or in hospitals or anywhere else, is at local level, where they are concerned about the quality of what is being delivered. And a good head teacher is not just somebody who's fantastic at dealing with parents, but who runs a system whereby the quality of the teaching, which is fundamental to the success of that much simpler institution, is absolutely fundamental to them, and they will work on the quality of their teaching staff. And of course, I think there are also parallels within the NHS.
Well, yes, and I thought Nikki Alexander, that's the Secretary of State for Education, when she was saying we want all schools to become academy schools, and that had a great resonance when somebody said we want all hospitals to become foundation trusts, and I started screaming at the telly saying, no, you don't want to do that, you'll end up with the same mess the health services ended up with.
Well, governments are fond of organisations.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's rather good. It's kept me in business for nearly 50 years. So.
Well, I can't remember, so I spent at least 10, 12 years trying to explain on the BBC how the internal market worked. And I think at the end of the process, I'm not sure I'd succeeded in explaining it to anybody, but I was sure that at the end of it, those who claimed it had been a complete disaster were wrong, and those who claimed it was a fabulous success were wrong.
Yes.
And I think we still suffer from over-exaggerating the impact of system reorganisation.
It's probably because we can't step back enough to see it, I think, probably. But we'll get to that in a minute. So there you are, you were a teacher in school, and then you got into journalism. How did that happen?
Well, I went into teaching on the grounds that I should have a profession to fall back on when I embarked on another career. So I'd always
wanted to be a journalist.
I'd always wanted to get into journalism.
So your family a journalist, or?
No, they're all lawyers.
Really?
Yeah, no, I was an escapee.
What a terrible upbringing.
Yeah.
Two lawyers. Where's social services
I used to write,
when you need them?
I used to write, I come from a legal family, but then that always begged the question of what an illegal family was.
Yes,
so I stopped saying that.
So you wanted to be a journalist?
Yeah, I'd always wanted to write, so I went in through the voluntary sector and worked, for example, for Age Concern England, and then I edited the newspaper for Physios Notice, Therapy, and then Nursing Times.
Yeah, Nursing Times was a big break for you, wasn't it? Really, it put you right at the centre of things.
It was at the time. Nursing Times was I'm not saying it isn't today. It was a very significant publication in the sense that it had it was in newsstand, but certainly when I left, it was selling over 90,000 copies a week, perfect bound, and it was like 140 pages, stuffed full of classified advertising. So it made Macmillan's, my employer, a great deal of money. There were two journals that were supporting the Macmillan empire. One was Nature, which is a rather different brother journal to the Nursing Times, but we were the two sources.
How 90,000 copies?
90,000
a week.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting how it's changed. I wasn't going to go there, but with our e-letter, we reached 300,000 a week.
Yeah.
Which is more, I think, than the independent newspaper. With every respect to the independent newspaper, and you know, we never set out to do that. It's just the unbelievably powerful force of social media, how it's changed everything.
Well, and obviously your success. I mean, the way in which people access media is absolutely going to change, and certainly my own view is that people who say, oh well, newspapers will survive, and they won't. I mean, it has to be old technology, doesn't it? And we will move on to a world where everybody is. You even see it on the tube now, in the train. You see people used to read even the free rags. They don't now.
Yeah.
They're now starting to look at their tablets and so on.
Do you read a newspaper, Steve?
I do read a newspaper, but I have it on my iPad, and so we have. And my wife has another newspaper on her iPad, so we kind of swap around.
Yeah, I mean, I still read the Times if I'm travelling, and it's gone up to £1.40, and I can't think why has it gone up 20 pence?
Yeah.
What am I getting more for? And I'm not. It looks like they want to price the paper out of the market to force us into an electronic future.
Well, I think the electronic future is the future. I think your success is part demonstration of that. And you can see that you know, everything from the Guardian offering its free good, which is causing them obviously some financial challenges and so forth, and those that are sitting behind the wall. People are constantly trying to reinvent themselves as the technology moves on.
Indeed, and the Independent has just gone to an electronic publication, isn't it? Yeah. I just like the Independent. Yeah, I don't know how we got into newspapers, but it is interesting how it's all changed. So there you were at the magazine. What happened then?
Well, I was offered the post of publishing director of the magazine group, and the guy said to me, "You're obviously a bit out there, you know, talking on the radio and television. Are you sure that you're going to be a backroom person?" I said, "Absolutely. Don't worry, I'll be fine." And literally 2 days later, the BBC phoned up and said, "Would you like to be the BBC's health correspondent?"
So you said,
maybe.
Yeah.
Lower salary, 1 year contract, no pension.
Really?
Yeah. So it was a little gamble.
It's more exciting though, wasn't it? And what did the BBC train you? Did they go, because now, I mean, they do actually spend a lot of time getting balance training and legal training and all that. Were you trained in those days?
2 days.
Enough for a lifetime.
Second day, phone call from the newsroom, can Neil come up because we want him to do a story? And then I never went back. So I didn't do any training at all at the BBC. I have to say, it probably showed, but I didn't. Though I'm sure it is absolutely right. Not least in what is faster moving, and it seemed jolly fast when I was there, but the pace at which people are expected to operate now, the number of outlets that an individual journalist has to deal with, I think it's very difficult, and the challenge, which was starting to appear in my time, of being able to reflect on what you were saying, as opposed to trying to react to the next event, and to try and put events into context, I think is enormously challenging, not least because everybody wants what is instant and what is now, not what is sometimes a bit grey, not black or white.
Yes, and there are no reflective programmes, are there? I mean, even Newsnight, which was the BBC's flagship, some of that's quite lightweight now, isn't it?
I wouldn't like to comment on the BBC, but I think I think news generally does have an enormous challenge, and we saw it in I left the BBC in 2000, the end of 2003, and even by then, the kind of pressure you were under in terms of the instantaneous.
But that's rolling news, isn't it? How they and the editorial decision. I mean, I don't know if you caught the Today programme this morning, but the Today programme this morning was like Talk Sport. It was all Leicester Football Club, and they had that little bouncy fellow with the glasses and the sore throat. What's his name?
Nick Robinson.
Nick Robinson. Lovely chap. Nice.
Sorry, Nick. Thoughtful and reflective chap.
Yes, he's very. But he was at a football club, and I was thinking, what the hell is he doing there? The whole programme was destroyed. Now, if you're into football, this is obviously a very big day. But I did not expect the BBC's flagship in setting the news agenda programme to turn itself into Talk Sport. I mean, they even interviewed the people who'd interviewed the people who'd interviewed the footballers. It was just horrendous. And of course, 5 Live was just wall to wall, but that's sport anyway. But the editorial decisions I thought were peculiar this morning. But you couldn't possibly. Why would you comment on the BBC? You don't work with them anymore.
No, it isn't. Particularly, my view is not worth any more than anybody else's. What I would say is that there can be a tendency to get carried away by a lead story, and again, I saw that within my own time, and so we'd get very excited about something, so it then takes up, actually you've got to put yourself back into the mind of the viewer or the listener and say, well, where are they at with this? There may be things where you're trying to say to them, look at this because it is very important, and so you may annoy them a bit, but you can overdo it. So I didn't hear the coverage, but
saturation coverage this morning. So who was the Secretary of State then when you first joined? Because you go back.
Joined the BBC.
Yeah.
John Moore.
Oh, I remember
John
him.
Moore.
Yes,
he was going to be the future Prime Minister.
Yes, he was a very good-looking, lusciously, and lots of hair. Didn't he? I hate people like that. But he had lots of hair, and he's very good-looking, and he was very engaging and well-spoken, wasn't he? I think Mrs. Thatcher quite fancied him.
Again, way beyond my knowledge, really, and figure around that. But yes, so he was seen as a great success. But actually, one of the programmes which I did, which looked at the Thatcher era, revealed from Nigel Lawson saying that John Moore kept on coming back with what Lawson described as more extreme ideas of how to reform the NHS, and each time the Treasury officials and Lawson himself would destroy all these proposals coming from the Department of Health, and she eventually got fed up and replaced him with.
He was ill
Ken
though,
Lilley.
wasn't he? He had
He became ill after he moved, though.
was it bronchitis or something?
Yeah, he
quite
did have a-
innocuous,
yeah.
but then he was very ill
He
with
was.
it.
But he moved to pension secretary by then. So
Oh,
she
didn't
split.
matter.
She split the department. It was the DHSS.
Yes.
She split it between the Department of Health and the Department of Social Security. He was pushed out to the Department of Social Security, and Ken Clarke was brought in
That's right.
as somebody who was not politically aligned with her in any way, but on the other hand, he was a bruiser and a fixer and all the rest of it. And he was the one who introduced the 1992 reforms,
That's right.
elements of which we can still see in the system today.
Yeah, that's when I think you and I first met. I remember I said something I wrote something about the doctor's first duty was to the organisation they were working in, assuming that everyone would understand that obviously we all have a much higher duty to the patients, and that was a sort of, you didn't have to say that. And then suddenly, I think it was the Daily Mail, the Today newspaper, I think it was, grabbed it, and they beat me up for saying. I mean, they didn't want to see the quote in its entire context. They just wanted to see that bit. And I think you did a very nice piece on the 6 o'clock news, I think it was, that rescued me.
Oh, really?
Well, you told the truth and the whole story. But that was interesting. In those days, of course, you did two pieces, didn't you? You did a bit for the telly and a bit for the wireless. Now, if you see, they record the one thing. Some that's got vision attached to it, and some hasn't. So I suppose that's because the pressures of time. That must be quite difficult to do, because on the one you're telling a story with the pictures, and on the other hand, you're telling the story.
Well, I mean, the argument's certainly gone on. So in my time, when I ended up as social affairs editor, so I had some management experience, responsibilities as well. The great debate was, do you have people who are just radio people because they know how to write for radio and they know how to speak for radio, and some would say they have a face for radio, and how do you do the television bit? In fact, I've still got the cutting in which when we did some reforms around this, and we did move people around based on their skills and started to develop people who had bimedial skills, and in other words, who could write. The grammar for television, the way for writing for television is very different from writing for radio. And I know very clever people, I'm sure now, can try and compromise the two, but they are very different because you write to the pictures, that's the whole point. And even the order of the piece is dictated by the power of the picture. All that stuff requires a different set of skills, or you can try and teach them to get people to do both, but some people find it very difficult to translate from one to the other. But I think it was The Independent wrote this piece where we'd move people around. There were people who were very cross that they'd been moved out of television or weren't getting the exposure that they thought they did. So there was a lot of anger around it. And the BBC press office said, so the headlines of all the popular press was, BBC goes for, good looks on television. Anybody without good looks is removed from television. And the BBC press office, I seriously put out a statement saying, this is absolute rubbish. For example, you can see, and they used this quote, Andrew Marr and Niall Dickson, and neither of them could possibly be said to be, I can't remember the expression, my wife was threatening to sue for holding us to account. So I have still got that cutting, actually. Thanks very much, press office. Yeah.
So it was a bit of luck, wasn't it? Because the Thatcher reforms made health a more interesting topic.
Much more.
And so you arrived at the right time, right place and right time. You need a bit of luck in life. And Ken Clarke was great, wasn't he? I used to love him. We used to have to go and see him. And
well, he was a maverick as well.
he said
was prepared to challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we used to go to, when he was Secretary of State, I just started the Confed in those days with John Greeton.
Yeah.
And we used to have to go and see the Secretary of State, and we'd go with a kind of list of stuff that we wanted to have a moan about. And he'd just sit back in his chair, light a cigar, because that was in the days when the Secretary of State smoked, and smoked in his office.
With cans of beer.
Cans of beer, yeah. In his office at the Department of Health. Just wonderful. I mean, you couldn't make it up. And he'd sit back in his chair and he'd say, well, why don't you just get on and bloody well do it? That was it.
Yeah.
He was great.
It's interesting, you've mentioned in your blogs about local pay, the contract going locally. Ken Clark with somebody else who we both know, Eric Keynes, who was his director of personnel, went around at that time, and he sent Eric off as his gauleiter, as it were, into the system, saying to NHS trusts, listen, guys, you can do this. You start doing your own pay. This is the answer. Local pay. Well, I think you were one trust in the whole country. I don't think anybody else did it.
I know.
So the door was open.
I believed all this.
The door was open, and the canary just sat there inside the cage. It never flew out. If you believe that, I'm not saying it's a good or bad idea, but the powers have been there for years, and in fact they were reinforced again when foundation trusts were created. And nobody has taken it up.
No, I mean, I looked it up, and I can tell you, it was the Health and Community, the NHS and Community Care Act, 1990, page 101, paragraph 6, and it actually says that trusts are free to engage staff on local paying conditions, and that's what we did. We did it at Homewood. We sat down with the trade unions, Cozy and Noopy, do you remember that?
I do.
Cozy and Noopy, and the RCN, and the BMA, God bless them, and we did our local paying conditions deal, which to pay for we had to do savings, internal savings. But the staff all signed up to it. They delivered, because the savings came out of efficiencies, and we did it. And we also had the only no strike deal in the NHS. Brian Mulwiney.
Before or since?
Yes, Brian Mulwiney. Do you remember him?
I do remember
So
Brian. He's in the Lords now.
Yes, Lord Mulwiney, and
Set up the Championship League, I think.
that's right. He went off and did a bit of football, and he came down and said, "Well, I don't believe you've done it. Show me how you did it." He had this great Ulster accent. So we did that, and then I suppose really, what happened then after that? The Thatcher years still managed to provide us with entertainment and you with plenty of stuff to write about.
It did, and though I think interesting enough, of course, in '97, Labour promised to reverse the Thatcherite reforms, and Frank Dobson came in and did reverse some aspects of the market. Though interestingly enough, by certainly the early 2000s, they decided. I think it was referred to as the M word. You weren't allowed to say market, but they were seeking to sort of introduce elements of it back in again.
It was Milburn, wasn't it?
Milburn,
Yeah, and Simon Stevens.
Yes.
Simon Stevens who's now the chief executive of the NHS, was a special advisor. He was Dobson's special advisor, because what a lot of people don't know about Simon, and he's been a guest at Health Chat as well. Simon has a strong Labour background. He was a Labour councillor, and everyone who accuses him of being right-wing and wanting to sell the NHS and all the rest of it is completely, entirely different to his philosophy. He's totally mischaracterised in that way. And he was Dobson's special advisor. Dobson came in, had a look at the books and had a heart attack and said it's all about the dosh. Remember that great quote, it's all about the dosh. And then Milburn came in. And that's when it all really, I think, all the Thatcher reforms just got re-Thatchered.
They did, but the crucial difference, I guess, between that era and the Thatcher era, which is probably, dare one say, the most crucial difference in all these discussions, is how much money you put into the system. So the Thatcher era had moments where they did put in more money, but you're talking about, well, if you think that the NHS needs about 3%.
6% of GDP in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah. Low levels of GDP. And you think year on year, in order to keep up, it probably needs 3% above inflation, depending on that kind of level. Then there were times when Lawson put in money to try and make the market system work in the early 90s, and then it kind of faded off again. So it went kind of slightly below trend, and then it went back up, all that stuff. But it bumped along, as it were, and meanwhile the system was struggling with the increasing demand that we've all seen. And then, of course, in 2000, they decided they were going to really pump money in, and they absolutely pumped serious money. I mean, we all complained about it during those years, said it wasn't enough and all the rest of it. But historically, it was unprecedented. We were getting things like 7% real increase in funding in the health service year after year. And that went on to, 2009?
Well, Blair promised to get us up to the European average, wasn't it? We were at 6% of GDP, and he got us up to 11%, 11.3, I think, which was the European average.
Yeah. So
and the money was completely wasted.
Well, that was the difference. You can argue wasted, not wasted, but if you think of the NHS as being an old engine which trundles along the road, if you pour oil, stroke money into it, actually, lots of it does go on the road because the engine isn't fixed.
Well, it's
But
like
it
it was a rich diet to a sickly patient.
Well,
I think.
yeah,
you
maybe
you
that's
said that
another
at the
way
time.
of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's. I mean, the waiting list came down to nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I remember my mum. She needed a cataract, bilateral cataract. Didn't do it bilaterally, but she needed cataracts done. So the doctor said, no, she went to the opticians. The optician said, cataracts. The doctor said cataracts. Within 10 days, she'd gone in and had the first one done. And then within a fortnight, she had the second one done. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, and there were, Andy Burnham, I think, said in the House at one stage, there were no waiting lists anymore. I mean, technically, he wasn't correct because there were some specialists that were, but fundamentally, waiting lists disappeared. But we didn't reform the system. That was the problem. But we kept the old sort of PCT format, which again was designed by Simon Stevens. And then,
well, so even he, I think, would acknowledge they created too many of them, and they didn't have the. And it was something that did concern the New Labour establishment at the time, that they didn't have the weight and the force in order to try and make commissioning work. I suppose it's fair to say the jury is still out on how you do make commissioning work, because since 1990 we've been having attempts to try
I think
and make
we've all decided it doesn't work.
Well, that might be.
We're now.
You could say that. I could possibly.
Vertically integrated, accountable care organisations. That'll be the next thing. But Milburn, I thought, pushed the envelope on Thatcherism much more than the Thatcher dared. I mean, in getting the private sector in, openly contracting with Netcare, the South African cataract providers, and so on. I mean, we had much greater. I mean, there was something I read something today. People were complaining about how Hunt has privatised the NHS. Hunt has done nothing to privatise the NHS. It was Milburn who really started to get the private sector in.
I think that's true, and of course they had specific targets around it. I suppose if you were a privateer, you would say yes, but they didn't do it in a fundamental way. They did it in the sense of how do we deal with our immediate problems, like how do we get our waiting list down and we employ these people for periods of time in mental health when we've got a particular problem, or you send them off to the private sector. But actually the system then reverts back again, for good or ill, because what happens is that the private sector is regarded as keeping these people too long. Oh, right, we'll have them back. And so they flirted with the private sector, who then actually got their fingers burned, and maybe next time will be less keen to go in. So I think, and at the moment, certainly the philosophy I see across the health service is there actually isn't a huge enthusiasm to kind of embrace the private sector. And the private sector isn't as gung-ho
There's
actually
no
as it
money in
was.
it. There's no money.
Well, that's the point.
I mean, if you look at Hinchinbrook, which was the best and biggest experiment, really, a whole hospital. Okay, it was only kind of a boutique hospital, 350 odd beds, but nevertheless, and they lost 5 million and paid 2 million to get out.
Yeah.
That was how bad it was.
Yeah.
Serco have pulled the plug. They don't do it anymore. I think Bupa have pulled out of the musculoskeletal deal they were in. Virgin, I mean, you hear all kinds of gossip about them hanging in there. I mean, one doesn't know, I suppose, but they're dealing with overheated economies and overheated block contracts, effectively.
Well, and if you looked at the social care sector, which, of course, where the private sector absolutely was not just let in, but ushered in and encouraged and so on, you've got, I think you pointed it out this morning, enormous problems because the funding is simply not there in order for people to run a business.
At lunchtime, did you see Care UK? Moody's have downgraded Care UK's debt to junk. I mean, that's Southern and Care UK in a week. I mean, that's a sector that is in big trouble, and there is no plan B. I mean, 30,000 employees, 500 care homes. I mean, if they go down to Swanee, what do you do? I mean, that's a bigger problem than the banking crisis, and no one's ready for it. And the CQC are now responsible for regulating the finances of the private providers and care homes. I mean, it's like having red light and red auto. Couldn't resist writing that this morning. But it is a big issue. So anyway, so coming back to your time at the BBC, what do you have a best interview? Do you have a best story?
The worst.
Yeah, go
I
on.
have the worst. The worst was appearing in Birmingham and they'd sent me up in a hurry, and they said, "Oh, don't worry about security; it'll be fine." The camera crew, Blunkett, had given some speech, and we went on to some quiet street in Birmingham. We had all the lights up, and about 20 to 10, I was the lead story in the 10 o'clock news. This madrasa just came out, the Muslim school. So these kids all pile out in large numbers. So I'm going, hold on a minute. There's me, there's the cameraman, and there's a guy in a truck. That's it. And we're going to be live. So I thought, this is too risky and whatever. And I made a bad call because, of course, they're saying, oh, I'm sure it'll be all right in the air. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And they said, oh, try it out. So I pretended. So I looked into the camera and I pretended that I was giving this thing, and I went, well, George, this, blah, 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 and they were absolutely fine. They sat there quietly and they all nodded. So, and then we stopped, and that was fine. So we thought that was okay. We did phone the police and said, it would be great if somebody could come, just because we're about to do a piece of 10 o'clock news. Plod arrived at 10:15, so that would be great. So I go on air, and it was George Alagai. I cursed him, I have to say, and it wasn't his fault at all. But once I'd done the first answer, I could tell that there was stuff going on behind me. There were guys at the side that were doing all this kind of stuff. People were pulling, like towels over their heads and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, right, they'll end it after the first answer that I've given. Not a bit of it. He then says, and I sort of acknowledged, well, there's obviously things going around here because that's what you have to do. And he then asked me another question. I felt like saying, why did you just ask me another question? Just go away, leave me alone. This is terrible. So of course I thunder on with the next answer. They start making more noise, and eventually some character runs up with a hand and puts it right over the front of the camera, live on the 10 o'clock news. I thought, this is the end of my career. I'm absolutely finished. And George said, he had said while I was doing my first answer, let's cut it. And the desk upstairs said, no, go for it. He's fine, he's doing fine. And we headed straight into disaster. So that's the worst one I've done. I suppose the one I remember most, funny enough, was the thing I mentioned, which is a phrase that is still used, which is about the NHS being a religion. And that was said by Nigel Lawson in the programme I just referred to earlier, where I did a series of 3 programmes on the history of the Thatcherite reforms for BBC Two. So it was a 3-hour documentaries. And in the interview, Nigel Lawson said, the problem is you've got to remember that the English, he said, he meant the British, the English only have one religion, and that's the National Health Service. And the trouble is, we as Tories are seen as non-believers. And that phrase has stuck along. It's absolutely true. Yeah. Ken Clarke also recognised it. He used to say, my purpose in being health secretary is not for me to get a voter to have their hand going down to put a cross that going from Labour up to Tory. He said, my only objective is to stop them going from Tory to Labour. I can't do it the other way. As health secretary, that's it's a damage limitation issue. The one person who probably changed that, funnily enough, is David Cameron, and he did it in, I was going to say this room, I think it was this room or downstairs. When he first became leader, he came in and said, I will have nothing to do with co-payment. This was at the King's Fund. I will have nothing to do with co-payment. I totally believe in the NHS, and he absolutely shot Labour's fox at that time. But if you look at the polls now, they've reverted to status quo ante, haven't they? Where people absolutely see the Tories as not being trustworthy, whether justified or not, see them not as justified.
Well, yeah, we had Jeremy Hunt as one of our guests, and we had quite a long chat about privatising. He had a neat answer. He said if the Tories were going to privatise the NHS, they'd have done it by now. So you can't, you've got nowhere to go really with an answer like that. But you and I made a programme. When I was the chairman of a trust, I know you're going to tell. Go on.
Well, the 2 things I remember about it. One was you had a Rolls Royce, and the idea was.
I think all the chairmen had Rolls Royce.
It was not my idea actually. It was my producer who said, apparently he's got a Rolls Royce. Get him to come in his Rolls Royce. Okay. And so he would drive me around his estate, the place he was shutting down, depriving all these patients with learning disabilities of their homes, all boarded up and everything else. And of course, he's grandly, flicking his fingers and all this kind of stuff. And then he said, "Don't make me." He said, "I know what you're up to. You're trying to make me out to be a right-wing Thatcherite, whatever. And but what I want to make sure is that you make me really right-wing, really Thatcherite, and only." And that was his comment. But the other thing I do remember was that which you now never would do, you didn't realise the power of the microphone. No. So you'd watched this. I had a pretty stroppy cameraman who was, you were absolutely spot on, he was a pain. But of course, we were now with his Rolls Royce in the back of a truck, because that's how you, in those days, you probably get a drone or something now, but you had to drive the Rolls Royce onto the back of the truck, and then you drive along with the truck pulling you along, and the cameraman stands on the bed of the truck and films you, and that's why it looks as if you're driving along. So Roy is sitting pretending to drive, and we're both kind of looking around and pretending to chat and all this kind of stuff. But the mics were both on, and the cameraman is sitting there with his earpiece on, filming away, and Roy says, "That bloody cameraman of yours, he's a stroppy git, isn't he?" I'm going, "Roy."
And also, I had to tell you that the trailer broke down, if you remember. The wheel collapsed, and the way
you threatened to sue, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And the wheel arches each side of my car was sufficiently high, so we couldn't open the doors to get out. So we were marooned in my car until somebody could get us off the bloody trailer. It wasn't our finest hour, was it? So what did you? Then you came here, didn't you? Why on earth did you leave the BBC? A plum job.
I thought I'd done 16 years, and you've stood outside number 10 for enough times, and I wanted to run something. I'd quite enjoyed the management aspects of Nursing Times, where had a management role, and I thought it would be interesting, and I thought this is a really interesting institution. And I thought I could do some things with it, so that's why.
You took over from Julia Neuberg.
I did.
Yes, stupid woman closed the bar. Do you remember? What a daft decision that was. We all used to come here after work and have a drink in the bar, and then Neuberg closed the bar because she said it wasn't public health or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there was a bar open during my time. It was only once a week.
I think you reopened. Yeah, Peter Griffiths. Peter Griffiths used to be the chief executive of Guy's. Remember?
Yeah.
And we all used to meet here in the bar downstairs. It was a kind of used to go downstairs to. It's all different now, but it was a little snoop thing. You could always find all the influential people of health in the King's Fun Bar. And then she closed it down, and that was the end of that. And then you came along. I mean, I think that think tanks have stopped thinking.
Discuss. I think I kind just describe the difficulty. I think there is the dilemma of being in this job here as chief executive of the King's Fund is an interesting one. There's on the one hand, how far do you go in attacking government and therefore finding all the doors are shut and you can't influence anybody, and how far are you prepared to compromise anything that you want to do? So I think that's a central dilemma which anybody running a think tank, of course, if you're a very strong political one, you can go on your political thing and you'll have your political friends. But I think for something like the King's Fund, where you want to exercise benign influence and try and genuinely affect and change policy, some of them may be quite small things, some of them may be quite good things. The biggest thing in my time that we affected, which I have to say didn't result in the end, it hasn't worked and so on, was social care. Because when I came here, I said that there had been a commission into long-term care. It had petered out, and people said, no, you can't do it, it's all over, the debate is over. And we got Derek Wanless to re-look at this again and devise a means by which we could have rescued social care. We had ministers saying, we're going to adopt this. We had the Tories saying, yeah, okay, we're really interested, we could go with this. And we really thought we had absolutely made it. And of course, along came 2008, no money, nobody's interested. They they've done Dill Not is a version of what we attempted to do. So that was a good example where I think actually we could have moved this debate on. It had quite challenging bits to it, but it was a serious recognition that social care was fundamentally underfunded, and that unless you found a way of cracking that, you would remain with the health service problems, and they were going to get a lot worse. Partly because the death rate was going to increase, which it has done. As the death rate increases, of course, you've got more people in the last bits of life, which is the most expensive bits of life. And we also learned that the tail of morbidity actually was long. So there was a theory back then, amazingly enough, that actually it didn't matter that we all lived another 20 or whatever years. If we still had 2 years of bad health, it was still 2 years of bad health. It didn't matter whether it happened at 68 or 88. But the reality is it isn't like that. The tail grows, particularly around dementia. So you've then got this very expensive tail which starts to grow. And that's what's causing this huge pressure both on the health service and on social care. We anticipated it, we identified it, and we attempted to enumerate it about how you might solve it, but didn't anticipate Lehman Brothers.
No, exactly. And one wonders really whether or not, as you kindly pointed out, I wrote about this morning. One wonders really whether or not it's gone too far. Is it recoverable now? And there's a bizarre phenomenon now in care homes, and I discovered this a couple of months ago, and I wrote about it then, that if you are a local authority paid person in a care home, your fees will be between £385 a week and £658 a week or something. That was some peculiar figures. If you were paying for yourself or your family, on average, the average will be struck somewhere between £1,500 and £2,500 a week. So now we've got the private sector subsidising social services. Most people think it should be the other way around.
Yeah.
And I honestly don't see how it's recoverable.
Well, I don't think the model works, but as you pointed out, the other thing that we haven't solved, sorry, this is again a reversion back, the first piece that I ever wrote, and I haven't written that many, but for the Health Service Journal, was in 1988 about a joint health service local authority residential place, which people had started to work out.
Wow. In the Valley of the Blind.
Yeah, well, exactly. And we still haven't cracked this.
No.
We still haven't cracked. And
Why do you think that is? Because it's
well,
so
I think
obvious.
it's two different funding systems. It is two different systems, and therefore one has to hope that with a degree of integration and imagination. That said, Northern Ireland, which has had joint health and social services, has not cracked the problem.
No. The Isle of Man has. I'm off the Isle of Man for a second or third visit. They haven't merged the services, but they work so closely together. Can't see who's which. But what about the Better Care Fund? That's not really worked, is it? I get stories all the time, people saying, they pinch money out of the Better Care Fund. That hasn't moved anybody closer.
I don't know the evidence. What I think is an endless series of one-off initiatives to try and pump prime something doesn't seem to work in the health service. It may have an effect on that one local bit or this other local bit. It doesn't seem to be transformative, and I think transformative probably comes more from the bottom up, where people actually work out the solutions themselves or are given the freedom to do so. Because I suspect, again, institutionally and legally, there are impediments at the moment.
Well, that's the issue. It's be careful what you wish for, because if you merge the two together, at the moment social care is means tested, healthcare isn't. That's a very porous boundary. Yeah. Will that flip? Could they both end up being means tested? Could you take a cohort of people and say, okay, everybody over 85 will have their healthcare and their social care means tested? Or you could do the other way around. You could say none of it over 85, none of it will be means tested.
And we all know that the distinction is pretty meaningless anyway. Why is somebody with dementia judged sometimes as a social care need and sometimes as a health need, and somebody with cancer is always judged as a healthcare need? These are
dementia and cancer.
I think badges of convenience.
Yes,
frankly.
exactly. And that's really what makes me think about the think tanks. and I'm not being rude about the King's Fund, but I find all of these so-called the Nuffield, the Health Foundation, all of them, they seem to just do a survey, collect other people's stuff, put it all together in a graph and make a comment and call it a report. It's not really, is it? I mean, the one list thing that you did was a report.
Well, the one thing we did was unusual because it was, I mean, partly to be fair, we borrowed a lot of the team from the Treasury that had done the original one list report. So it was very numbers orientated in terms, and it, again, some of these things are getting it at the right moment. So I'll give you an example of one where we got wrong, I think. Well, I got wrong, and I don't blame him for it, but actually it was Simon's idea. Because I went to Simon and said, if you were me, what area might you look at? And he said this right at the start of my time here. And he said I'd look at maternity care, the safety of maternity care. And I got round to it after about 3 and a bit years, and I thought, right, okay, we're going to do this. And we did a safety inquiry. And I think if you read that inquiry now, and you read it, and I think the Morecambe Bay people would recognise this, the lessons are all there. We identified all this stuff then. But here's an admission, not that we were very clever, or that we did get very clever, nor Neil, the philosopher, led it, because I didn't want to have a gynaecologist or a midwife chairing this, or even on the panel. They had advisors, but the panel were all non-professional in that sense. I mean, there was a surgeon who was really into numbers and that kind of thing, and there was a patient safety professor and so on. We produced that report, and I think it was a really good report. But did it change the world? I'm not sure it did. And the question was why. We tried to follow up. We ran events. We got people together. We did whatever. But changing culture is really difficult, as you know. And I think that probably shows, if you're there at the right time, you produce the right report that's just captures the zeitgeist of that moment, then you can ride that wave, and you can be a nudge that really does change things. But a lot of the time, let's be honest, it'll be what people hate, just another report, because that's what most reports are.
I know, and they come out with such regularity, and most of them are just completely useless, I think. I was just trying to think of a think tank that's done anything that makes me think. And the only one I can think of is Reform, which, Reform, and everybody here belongs to Reform, but I think Reform are the sort of dad's army of think tanks, really, aren't they? But they did the Social Market Foundation stuff, didn't they? They did the voucher systems, and you don't necessarily have to agree with all this stuff, but they make you think. And I somehow think we've stopped thinking. I mean, Simon is a huge brain.
He is.
And he's a great partner with the Jim Reaper, as we call him. Jim Mackey, who runs NHS.
Improvement.
Not Monitor, I think I call them. Not Monitor. I mean, they're a great team. Different as chalk and cheese. So Simon's still thinking. The vanguards are supposed to make us think, but I'm worried that how robust they will be, taking us into the future.
I think the enemy of all these things is time, because on the one hand, if they're politically driven, politicians, there's a particular clock that works on the electoral cycle and affects the way that politicians work and so on. And then there's NHS time or social change time, and it's very different. And sometimes these longer cultural changes aren't actually given the time in order to really make a difference to the organisations and the cultures that they're working in.
Well, I mean, now we've got a Secretary of State who would tell us that his legacy, he wants to make hospitals safer. He's got him embroiled in a ludicrous dispute, really. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the news today, but BMA are now asking the TUC to consider a day of action across the whole of the public sector, which is general strike in the public sector. I mean, God knows where that will go. Do you think hospitals are unsafe?
I think that there are unsafe bits of hospitals.
Yes.
I'm sure of that.
What do you make of the weekend data?
Have
Have you looked at?
No, I'm not, absolutely not an expert. We might ask Mike Richards and
Well, he
so on.
didn't see that
I think
answer
I think the answer is that if you manage to put in the numbers that you required in terms of not just doctors in training, but senior doctors and all the support staff that is required around that, then some of the discrepancy which you do see around that period, not just on Saturday, Sunday, but over that period, might be challengeable, as I understand the evidence. But that's I'm not an expert. So
there were five major
question
studies.
is getting
There were five major studies, and two, one in Germany, one in Sweden, and they all indicate there's something, but there's no causation. That's the bit that's missing, causation. Do you? I mean, this moves us on now really to the third plank of what I want to talk about, which is your current job at the GMC. Do you analyse any of that data? Can you see trends?
not around. So we certainly wouldn't look at mortality trends around that. What we are.
No, I meant from the complaints aspect.
Oh, well, in terms of yeah, we are starting, I think, now in a way that would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years ago, to look at what our complaints mean, where they come from. So, for example, we've done and will produce more and more data of this kind, but which demonstrate that hospitals which are 2 years away from special measures, for example, see an increase in the rate of referrals into the GMC. So there are correlations around.
Say that again, that's really interesting.
So hospitals that end up in special measures are will see a rise in their fitness to practice referrals into the GMC. And increasingly what we'll be able to do is give every trust in the country the ability to look at all our data and to analyse that data themselves, to look at their performance. So how does their referral rate into the GMC
That's really
compare
important,
with
that's
other...
I mean, that is really important.
It is important.
So you could almost predict where the problems will come.
Well, I think at this stage, let's say we're only asking questions rather than providing answers. I don't want to overstate this, but for example, if we were able to show that if you went to medical school A, your chances of being referred into fitness to practice were significantly higher than if you went to medical school B. That would raise a question if I was in medical school A, would it not? Mm. Now, all this stuff used to be the detritus of medical regulation or professional regulation. It was the operational stuff we did. Actually starting to understand and analyse this data. So we, I think, for years sort of thought there might be something about locums, that, you know, what is it, people complain about them and so on. But of course, once you start to analyse and you understand the data, you do see that you get an increased rates of referrals that are coming from locum agencies. So starting to understand, or locum doctors, the issues around international medical graduates. Why are they more likely to be referred? Why are they more likely to have serious sanctions against them? Why is it that we now have a wealth of data about hospitals where we put them under enhanced monitoring, where their doctors in training are not being supported properly within a particular department? That information is absolutely vital for that trust, if it bothers to look at it, to understand what is going on in that department, which is not going on in that department there. So it's not necessarily a resource issue, but it may be a resource issue in terms of we actually haven't got the consultants or we can't recruit them in order to be able to do that. So I think one of the roles that regulation increasingly will perform is moving away from just being, if I put it this way, somebody else's expression, but a philosopher regulator, where we're concerned with ethics and so on, to be more scientific. So not that we have the answers, but we actually do have data which is increasingly useful for people who are actually directly providing services. And that, for me, if I'm running a trust, understanding how well am I managing my doctors, how well are we doing in terms of the education that we're providing for postgraduate education, that data that I can then use to improve myself, not the GMC won't improve you, but holding up that data like a mirror to the system. And again, across the whole system, cosmetic surgery is another really classic example. We were blind. We just, we didn't see. But, if you asked our fitness to practice, well, no, we have nothing. We can't see any problem with. Once you start scratching it, you take away all the stuff, you actually, and Sally Tabor is here in the audience, Sally would have said that there are problems in cosmetic, but we're saying, well, there's nothing we can see. Once we start to dive into the data, we are absolutely able to see that the rates of referral are higher in this area than in other areas. That means we can't instantly solve the problem, but we can hold a mirror up to the system and say, look guys, this is what's happening, so do we all need to do something about it? And we've just produced, it's not a solution for anything in some ways, but we've produced really strong new guidance for those who are entering cosmetic surgery. We've absolutely marked the card of the industry in terms of how they perform, and if people cross that line, then we will absolutely deal with it. These are some of the most vulnerable patients who are going into this area. But unless you have the data, you don't actually understand that this stuff is going on. So it's really important to do that. And I think that is probably going to be the biggest change going forward, is how do we use data effectively, and it will apply to the performance of teams, the performance of individuals, the performance of trusts as well. Not to bash people over the head, but how do we use it as an improvement tool?
Mm-hmm. And the NHS is not kind of tooled up for that, is it? We did a visit to the Health and Social Care Information Centre, that's now also called something else. I don't know why they keep doing this, but they have an enormous amount of performance data in there. I would call performance data, and we have so little capacity to make it meaningful. And you know, I mean, I give CQC a hard time. I've no time for them at all. I mean, the whole idea of, you know, turning up with this charabang of 150 people with clipboards is just ridiculous. But we've got the data where, you know, one of the questions I want the NHS to answer, if I was running a trust now, I'd say, the question is, how do we do today? Right? When I was doing it, we couldn't tell how we were doing this month or in the last quarter, you know, really. How are we doing today? It is perfectly possible and feasible and doable to know how we're doing today. Mm. And if you take three measures, hospital standard mortality ratios, which we know, you know, there's controversy around them, but Jarman came and gave us a very entertaining evening with those. If you analyse those, if you look at complaints, customer complaints as I was called them, and you look at staff factors, sickness, leaving, and attitudes. If you analyse, you triangulate those three things, you don't really need to know anything else.
I know you don't like it though, but I actually, well, I'm just about to know, friends and family, for staff rating,
so you can
friends and family, it seems to me, well, I don't know if it's true or not,
I've published a guide on how to fiddle it.
There are huge variations in that.
It's because they fiddle it.
You think the good ones just fiddle it?
Yeah, of course you do. When you ask the question is the key point. If someone goes in hospital, they're in pain.
I'm talking about asking staff, not patients.
Oh, the staff. Oh no,
staff asking staff. Would you recommend this to your family? I'm not talking about patients.
No, I see what you mean. No, I don't. I don't rate that at all. In fact, one of the things that we're working on at the moment is.
Well, if only 50% of your staff would recommend your institution,
that's
a pretty good measure to me.
I wouldn't discount it entirely. It's just the way that it's collected. No, I mean, we're working at the Academy of Fabulous Stuff. We're working on a new initiative that we'll be doing soon called the Fabometer, and we're going to give every member of staff in the NHS an app, and they can tell us how they got on today, and they can press the green button, the amber button, or the red button, and we'll have a Fabometer that day. And we can share it with the public, the staff, other trusts, and the Secretary of State, and the Prime Minister.
If somebody else doesn't do it tomorrow, Roy, now you've told them. Thanks. Tip top.
I don't care if someone else does it. The important thing is it's done. I don't care who does it. We do it. It's going to cost me money. John and I'd have to write another cheque. No, I don't care who does it. But you know, that's the way I think I would do it. But coming back to your role, I think it's really interesting that you're at the point now where you could benchmark this data. How do you feel about publishing?
We will publish. We will absolutely.
The transparency.
We've already started publishing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We will name and we will publish.
You will name.
Not to shame, but because transparency is the future. We have to be. This is where it is all at. One of the things we're looking at is the future of the register and what we can actually put. The register at the moment is a bit like the register in 1858. It hasn't really changed a huge amount. The amount of information.
Is it still a big book?
No, it is online. It's very accessible in that sense. But actually, it's
what's happened to the books?
Well, the books are still in our reception, and yeah, I'm sure your grandfather or whatever is in there. But it's accessible, but actually it only gives you very limited information. And I think that my prediction is that in 15 or 20 years' time, we have to make this thing, and I hope we'll start the journey this year, much more useful for patients, much more useful for employers, and much more useful for doctors themselves.
Isn't the whole thing just a complete waste of money? I mean,
the register.
Yeah, you're the GMC. I mean,
You've just agreed with me that the
data
data is very useful.
Well, you might, yes.
There are a couple of things on your fabulous stuff that are ours as well. So obviously there are a few exceptions.
Well,
not total,
but it just seems
partial waste. Then,
it's a complete waste of money. Look, I mean, we want to know that someone is qualified and their qualifications are genuine. That's a reasonable thing to know, and you can stick that on a computer, do it online. You can rent 2 rooms above a chip shop in Milton Keynes and run your entire operation for about 3 and 9 pence. As it is, you've got these great glass buildings everywhere, palaces, lavish, beyond lavish carpet that you sink into. I mean, unbelievable. And for what? I mean, it's the employer's job. If I'm an employer, right, and somebody complains about a doctor, and I have a look at it and I take it seriously and I think there's something in it, right, I'm gonna by the end of the week I'll have gathered the information. We've had a bit of an inquiry, and I said to him, Fred, you're fired. And that's it. I don't need you to palaver about for 15 months and make lawyers fat.
Okay. So there's one country in the world that followed your advice.
Oh God, North Korea. Was it?
No, Chile, under Pinochet, actually. He managed to abolish professional regulation and so on.
He wasn't all bad, was he?
You said that on me. I think that, so he worked on the principle that caveat emptor was absolutely fine as far as patients are concerned. I think that your point is a challenging one. So what is the purpose of professional regulation? Interestingly enough, it's applied in every country in the world, including Chile, which is trying to get it back again. So I think that the first point is that it is universally recognized as being something that has potential. How far you go with it from your de minimis to something that extends beyond its usefulness, I think is an absolutely...
But you're publishing guidance, you're duplicating stuff.
So we're publishing guidance. So is the cosmetic guidance that we've just published, is that going to be useful or not useful? Question. Secondly, well, let me just finish.
Yes, sorry.
So in terms of usefulness, you said let's rely on employers. Employers have had an obligation to have doctors have a regular check every year. They've had that within the NHS contract since the early 2000s. By the time that we started revalidation, there were NHS trusts where SAS doctors, who arguably are the most vulnerable group, as it were, the least supported, not been through training, 15% of them were getting appraisals, 85% were not. Most of the consultants were getting checked, but these individuals, who arguably represent both the need for most support and possibly the greatest risk, were not getting that support. Since we've introduced our nudge, and that's what I would describe revalidation as, all these rates have gone rocketing up. Now, are all these appraisals great, wonderful? No, I'm sure they're not. A third of doctors say they've changed their practice as a result of this process. So as a social intervention, not without some impact, and I'm sure it can get better. So my answer to your question is not that you're entirely wrong. Regulation is riddled with a law of unintended consequences. You try and do one thing and something else happens, just the same as politicians. But I passionately believe that regulation can make a difference. Since the law was changed in June 14, there are 1,500 doctors that we've turned away from Europe who are no longer practicing in this country. Employers would not have stopped them. 1,500 doctors who did not meet our standards for speaking English effectively to practice in this country. So there are 1,500 doctors who can't practice now and who should not have been practicing in this country, and we've managed to stop that. There are 2,000 doctors who said, I don't want to have my practice checked. Well, frankly, You know, you wouldn't say that about a pilot. You wouldn't even think about it. You talked about your responsibility for running an NHS trust. I think your first responsibility is, are the people I'm employing any damn good? Am I keeping in touch with them? Do I actually understand whether they're any good or not? What we're doing is not saying we should be doing this, absolutely not. But we're now working alongside responsible officers, senior medical directors to do their jobs better. And if you ask them, nearly 90% of them will say the GMC support is really positive, and we have started doing things that frankly we should have been doing years ago. So I absolutely don't accept that we're without impact. We are making an impact, but of course there's a danger you can go too far. There's a danger you can interfere too much with institutions. And above all, the most important part of regulation, and the bit of guidance I'm most proud of in a way, is about raising concerns, which is trying to empower people at local level to raise those concerns. We set up a confidential helpline. Nearly 2,000 doctors have phoned up to report problems with their colleagues in that time. That's a shaming thing, because in a way they should have been able to do it at local level. So we've provided an outlet for them to do that. So I think a regulator can have an impact at national level, but you've got to be cautious about what you do. You've got to work with the profession, not for them. You can't be the doctors' club. You mustn't be the doctors' club, but you can work alongside doctors in order to try and advance professionalism and protect them. I think our biggest challenge, frankly, at the moment is the profession's morale is way below this floor and deepening down. And I think that will make our life more difficult as we try and work positively with the profession, but it's also a problem for everyone else.
Cyril Chandler, who sat in that seat and we had a chat about regulation, we're sort of kindred spirits, I think, Cyril and I. He talked about the impact of the and he opens it up and he sees he's under investigation.
Yeah.
And of course it does end up sometimes with doctors taking their own lives and doctors becoming really ill as a result of it. I mean, partly it's the time it takes, isn't it, to investigate these things. Partly it's the shame of it all, the way in which it's all structured, you know, reported to, investigated by. It's a pretty. I mean, one wonders if some of the language isn't wrong. If it's you know, it's as old as the registers that are still leather bound. Maybe we need to accept the fact that people are perhaps more likely to complain these days, because they do. And the facility for them to complain is a lot easier. There's less deference on behalf of the public, and so perhaps they're more willing to step forward. And one wonders really, we hear a lot about sorting out bad doctors, but not everyone who's complained about is a bad doctor.
No, they're not. So obviously this has exercised my thoughts very much for the last 6.5 years. We have a cumbersome legal process, which we have been desperate to try and get legal reform into. We've got some legal reform. So this year we got a right of appeal. We now have an independent adjudication process. So there are no longer GMC panels. This is run independently by an independently appointed judge who's accountable to Parliament, and the Medical Practitioner Tribunal Service treats us as the prosecutor in exactly the same way as it treats the defence, and we have a right of appeal against decisions that we don't agree with, and all that's helpful. We've also tried to introduce lots of initiatives to try and support doctors. We use the BMA's Doctors for Doctors service, which we provide free for every doctor who comes into our procedures. We now offer doctors a meeting where we can discuss with them. We're only allowed to do it for certain kinds of cases, but where we can actually discuss with them how we can resolve the thing consensually while still protecting the public. We've tried to find ways in which we can speed up the system. We've had a massive increase over the period that I've been at the GMC in the number of cases you mentioned. Over that period, we get just over 8,000 cases a year. The funnel is quite tight, so the number right at the end, the number of doctors we strike off of 267,000 doctors on our list, 63 were struck off last year. Interestingly enough, I just learned that California strikes off 4 times as many doctors as the GMC. So quite interesting how the system works. But you're right, the system still engenders fear. And there are two reasons for that. One is I think it's just kind of built into the system, and we need to. And the GMC used to simply sit in the hill and wait for stuff to come, fire out rather legalistic and antagonistic letters, and then wonder why people were a bit frightened of them. I think we're making real efforts. You know, we've met 100,000 doctors since our regional liaison service was set up. The reaction from doctors is hugely positive. So I think we can reach out and we can provide things that are useful to the profession. So we will try to do that. But the other problem with the system is that the threshold for us investigating is set in law. So we investigate over 2,000 cases. We only take action at the end of the day, and most of this is advice, not even anything more, against something like 1,000. So there are more than 1,000 doctors every year that we suck into this pretty horrible process, and we're trying to do everything we can to make it as less horrible as it were. It always will be frightening and difficult for them. And at the end of it, of course, we say thank you very much. We don't say sorry because legally we had to do what we had to do, but they still have gone through a very difficult process.
It's a bit like the Met Police, isn't it? Not being able to say sorry.
Well, we can say sorry when we've done something wrong, but actually, and we absolutely, and we are changing the way we write our letters.
Another form of words.
We can use a different form of words. What we can't say is we made a mistake in going in investigating this. The law said this happened. You met the threshold. We have to investigate. That is, I think you have to make.
Okay, isn't it? You can say the complaint was made. We have a legal duty.
Yeah.
We have to investigate. You've been through a process which everyone accepts
Yeah.
is difficult. We're very pleased that
Exactly.
you're going to continue practicing and providing services to people in a career that you should be proud of. I mean, you can say that.
So that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we're changing all our letters to try and make them as less legalistic and obviously not crossing whatever line the lawyers tell us we can't cross. But we've been too governed by lawyers in the way that we've communicated, and I think we are definitely pushing back on that.
What about the public? Do you think you've served the public better? One gets complaints really about the public who say, "Oh, I complained to the GMC and nothing happened." And
Yeah.
the public do. When you consider this is our noblest public service, the one held in highest regard, and the Lawson and all the rest of it, it's a bloody hard organisation to complain about, isn't it?
Well, and I think you're right. There's first of all, we need improvements in how the NHS itself handles complaints. I'm not excusing anything that the GMC does, but complaints, a lot of the stuff that we do should absolutely be done at local level and should be resolved at local level and don't need to go to us. And our ambition in the longer term, and this is not about trying to get rid of our responsibilities, is that if a responsible officer can manage this situation so that the public are protected at local level, then, and we're not talking about somebody accessing kiddie porn or doing terrible stuff like that, if it's a sort of competence issue and they can manage that safely at local level, why on earth do you need to go to the GMC? And this particularly applies, you talked about doctors taking their own lives. Many of the doctors who take their own lives, not all, many of the doctors who take their own lives arrive with us in a terrible state. So the idea that these are people living a happy-go-lucky life and suddenly they find themselves in the GMC and the GMC does something terrible to them, that is a travesty. And Lewis Appleby's just done a lot of good work for us in helping us take this forward. I'm sure would agree with that. So it's not a question of everything was going right until the GMC came along. Often what you get is people who've had suicidal ideation before they come into our processes. So these are people who already, they probably lost their job. They've been, their family often is in a very difficult state. So they're fragile. The problem is, how do we manage them through a process which, again, the law says you must protect the public during this process. So we've got that side of it. But how do we do it in such a way that we put whatever we can to try and support those individuals or make sure that they're supported at local level? And the work that Lewis has been doing with us is to try and help us try and get our own systems right so that we will never stop people being very, very distressed by this process. But the more we can put in, and just to do the flip side, Claire Gerarda has said this as well. There are doctors who have gone into our system who would say, had I not been referred to the GMC, I would have taken my own life, because they provided that jolt or that protection during that period. So it's not all bad, but we can do it. We're determined we can try and do this better. I know we've been castigated by it. We didn't need to do this. We absolutely wanted. I kept on reading these reports which said, doctors, you know, they're not frequent, but read reports. Doctors committed suicide under our procedures. This is what we did. We can't really see anything we could have done more. But you know, you just you want to say, well, that isn't good enough. We need to try and dig in, which is why we did the independent review in the first place, and why we got Lewis Appleby to try and look at it. So anything we can do to try and protect doctors who are going through that procedure. I think the Doctors for Doctors service has been really helpful. We have a problem with unrepresented doctors, so either because their medical defence organisation has said we're not going to have anything more to do with you, or because they haven't paid a medical defence organisation in the first place, they can then find themselves in front of the Medical Practitioner Tribunal Service. Again, we're trying to find ways in which we can help them more as they go through that process.
I mean, I know you're doing an enormous amount, which is really why I led you down that road. But I think it brings me back to my original point. I was kind of teased you about it earlier, but I just think that a lot of the responsibility for this lies with the employer. Not more, I think, in the sense that if someone's behaving badly, then it should have been spotted earlier, always. If performance is poor, it should have been compared and contrasted so the individual understands. If there's a complaint, the employers need to deal with it promptly, expeditiously, quickly, settle it where it can be, where it's a very serious matter and procedures are put in place. It just seems to me that the trusts, and I understand it, are so preoccupied with other matters that really this is a very low down item on their agenda, and it really shouldn't be. We are just not very good at looking after our staff. You know, I'm not. I know you won't talk about you won't talk about the strike. I know, but I mean, you know, we've got 54,000 junior doctors, the backbone of the NHS. Somehow or other, we've managed to piss them all off. You know, we've got the nurse situation. We just, because I think it's partly because what I would regard as the employer's responsibilities are kind of shipped off to you, and they're shipped off to some cranky system of negotiating pay and conditions when nobody's involved and everybody's involved. It's all done at arm's length. If the trust were, and it brings us right back to the Thatcher reforms, if the trust were better prepared, better equipped, better run, standalone, properly run organisations, then half of this wouldn't happen.
So I'm not disagreeing with you. I think there is a lot more that can be done at local level.
Absolutely.
I think that actually the creation of responsible officers answers one of the central challenges I would have made to you, which is that's fine. You're concerned with consultant A, but actually, by the way, on Saturdays and Sundays he goes down the road and does X, Y, and Z, and you have no role or control over that at all. With the responsible officer system, the responsible officer is responsible for the entire practice of that doctor at local level. And that is the key to the future. So I think we're agreeing.
Is that a role that needs to be strengthened?
Well, no, I'm not sure. I mean, it is amazingly strong, I have to say. Just read the regulations. They are very strong. And these guys and girls are starting to do stuff now that was never done before.
What it reminded me of, it took me back to journalism, where you get journalists embedded in the front line. I mean, effectively, you've embedded your people in the front line.
Well, that's true. I want to quickly say, before anybody contradicts it, the responsible officers are accountable to the trust.
Yes.
They're responsible to the trust and to the trust board. They do have a line to a senior responsible officer within the NHS, and they've adopted a line to us. So there are three kind of lines of accountability, but their central responsibility is to the organisation.
Is that a model we should be copying for the Guardian role? Because that's gone way off the rails, isn't it? Francis was on the wireless this morning at lunchtime trying to defend the indefensible, where they've appointed a workplace guardian who took one look at the job and threw in the towel. The assistant deputy, whoever she is, threw in the towel. It's one of the most important jobs in the NHS, we're told, but hey, it's a part-time it's a part-time job. I mean, you could not have done that worse if you really set out to screw it up.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to comment on guardians or whatever. What I would say is the bit that does frustrate me a bit that has not yet been really brought out, and it will be a focus back to us. I mean, it will be the finger pointed back at us. Is we issued new guidance at the beginning of this year on education and training for doctors, and it is the most pointed in terms of what is the responsibility of employers. And in that sense, we don't regulate employers, but we do hold them to account for how they treat doctors in training or how they treat medical students who are coming onto their patch. If we are serious about these standards, and I accept they are going to be extremely challenging because of the pressures that are on the service. So I can hear trusts already saying, well, that's fine, mate. You have these wonderful things about saying, you know, rotas must not put too much pressure on staff, but hey, I've got to run this service. I understand that tension. But if we have got a contribution to make, it has to be saying, these are the standards which we expect you to follow. And they ought to be standards that doctors in training can use, and that people and that local education bodies like HEE can use against trust, if that's the right word, who are not doing their job properly.
It just piles on more pressure, doesn't it? I mean, you get the CQC who turn up, so there's not enough nurses here, not enough nurses, therefore this trust is badly led, therefore the board's got to go. I mean, none of it is helpful, I don't think. I don't think I need you to tell me that I need to look after junior doctors.
So
I just don't have enough of them.
Well, hold on. You were just saying a few minutes ago how the problem was that employers were not looking after their junior doctors.
Well, don't expect any logic from me. You're the one with the answers. Well, I mean, look at the guidance you produce for striking doctors. I never seen it. Honestly, I just shredded it. I mean, what did you said to the junior doctors? You said you're a junior doctor. You know,
we didn't say that. We said you're a doctor in training. We don't use the infantile.
Okay, you're an what is it? An FY1 or something? Foundation Year 1 or whatever it's called these days. Yes, and so if you're going to go on strike, you need to assure yourself that your patients will be safe. How the hell is a kid supposed to do that?
Well, kid is an interesting expression about senior
professionals. Well, let me clarify that. So, I mean, look, they're okay.
First of all, these are professionals who have obligations. They are not somebody who's on a work training program.
They're young junior doctors who are probably in the first time they've ever been working in a hospital. They're youngsters. I mean, it's not pejorative to say they're kids. I mean, they could be my grandchildren.
Doctors in training vary from those who are at the start of their career to those who are 15 years into their career.
Exactly, which is why your guidance is used, because you can't say to these young doctors with no pull, no power, no influence, ensure yourself that this is going to happen before you go on strike. And on the other hand, I get correspondence from junior doctors saying, I went on strike yesterday, or I didn't really want to go on strike, but I was put under so much pressure from the local BMA representative, I didn't know what else to do.
Okay, so the question is, what advice or guidance should we have given? The guidance advice that we've given, interestingly enough, has actually received quite a lot of support from the profession and got the endorsement of the High Court, which described it as, I paraphrase, but sensible and timely advice. What we were trying to say is, what is our responsibility in law? Our responsibility in law is to advise doctors on their professional responsibilities. Their professional responsibility is to make sure that if they are moving away from care, that there is suitable arrangements in place in order to be able to do that. Now, there may be those who will argue that as a trade union member, it's entirely the responsibility of the employer to deal with that. I have no responsibility as a doctor. Good medical practice does not say that. And we believe that doctors do have a responsibility. And of course, the level of their seniority is a factor in this and how far they can influence it. But what we were asking them to do, and we still are asking them to do, is if you're going to take industrial action, what we want you to do is have a discussion with, might be your clinical director, or it might be the senior consultant you're saying, talk to them about what arrangements are they putting in place while I'm not going to be there. And as far as you can, only as far as you can, satisfy yourself that things are going to be all right. What would be wrong is if the trust were saying, and again, they have to be held responsible for being honest and truthful about this, saying, listen mate, we cannot cope. We are absolutely, for X, Y, Z reason, we can't cope. Then we would say, you have an obligation to respond. And the BMA kind of agrees with us, because it says when there's an emergency, you need to go in and fulfill that. So I don't know that what we were saying was not bland. We've hyped it up because we do think that withdrawing emergency cover raises another very important issue. Again, just making sure that during that period that you're not providing emergency cover, that the hospital will be able to provide something that is guaranteeing patient safety. And secondly, that doctors should reflect on the cumulative impact of this. So if this keeps on going on and on, it is going to start having an effect on people with chronic conditions. It is going to have an effect on outpatients who are going back for cancer treatment and all the rest of it. And I think that doctors need to start reflecting on that issue.
Why don't you just say going on strike is a dodgy thing to do, don't do it?
Because that wouldn't be legal. The Parliament has not...
Your opinion?
No, law. We're a body set up by statute. So ordering doctors have a right to strike.
No, I'm not saying no.
So we cannot say you cannot go out.
It's not what I'm asking you. What I'm saying to you is you've issued guidance on the strike, whether to strike or not.
Yeah.
Well, what to do and all the rest of it. There's no legal obligation on you to do that. You've done it. You've issued.
Well, I think we have a duty to provide guidance.
But there's no legal obligation. You consider it as your duty to offer some guidance to doctors. You say you're there to protect patients as well. Surely, don't you have a duty to say to doctors, look, withdrawing your labour is dodgy and dangerous. It will put patients at risk. Don't do it.
Well, I think what we have to say is that the doctor has to make the decision themselves about what the impact of the action that they're taking would be. And I think you could make an argument that my withdrawal of labour for this period of time, when the hospital is able to put in senior consultant cover where there was junior cover before, isn't actually damaging to
Outpatients?
Well, as I say, over a period of time, patient inconvenience as opposed to serious harm, which is our thing.
An outpatient point isn't inconvenient. An outpatient point is important.
Well, it may be serious and it may be inconvenient. What I'm saying is that over time, well, it may well be both, but is that over time, it seems to us that the seriousness of this should make the doctor reflect more about whether they should or shouldn't do it. But it has to be the doctor's individual decision about what action they are going to take.
Hang on, we've got 110,000 people now have been knocked off the waiting list, or in one way or the other.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, what's cumulative? 110 is okay, 200,000 isn't. I mean, where do you start?
Well, I think we will look at, what I think we have to do is look at what the situation is. I think the health service is actually managed pretty well. I entirely accept the point that for people who are waiting for surgery, who may have to wait longer, that is and could be harmful for those individual patients. And we absolutely have asked doctors to reflect upon that. But what we haven't done is say, no, you cannot strike, because Parliament did not decide to fetter, as it has lots of other professions.
No, but you could say you shouldn't. You could say, and stay within your legal remit, you could say you shouldn't go on strike because it's dangerous and dodgy and risky.
Well, I don't know that. Well, we will have to make a judgment about what the situation is, and obviously the situation is currently fluid. I think that's probably as far as they go.
They're going to come out again, aren't they? It's pretty obvious they're not going to give up. They'll be out again.
Well, we've tightened up, as you noticed. I'm sure you shredded the second piece of guidance rather than the first. On the second piece of guidance, we were more, I think, censorious is the wrong word, but we were more directional, I think, than the first.
I tell you what, I spent a lot of time on the picket line. and I feel very sorry for the junior doctors. I really do. I think they've been buggered about with this contract, and if you look at it, there are some difficulties with it, and a lot of them that I mean, Terry and I have been out filming, and they don't know the issues because a lot of them haven't read the Dalton letter, they haven't really read the contract. I think they've been sold a pup by the BMA in many cases, and I think that, and I have to say that I don't think your advice to them is either known about, to be honest, a lot of the junior doctors in the picket line, and neither is it very helpful for them they are facing, they're under enormous pressure. I mean, they're not walking out for fun. You talk to the junior doctors, they're the brightest and the most intelligent people that we've got. Yeah. And a lot of them are, and I don't mean this to be a pejorative way, but a lot of them are setting out on their lives, and it's a big step. They've got lots of other worries and concerns, and a lot of them don't really know what to do about this, and a lot of them have been bullied to go on strike, and I've got a post bag that will support that. And I think that for you to say to them, well, you've got to go and talk to your medical director and see what's what, they can't do it.
Well, I don't think we're just saying that. We're asking them to reflect on what we can't do if there is intimidation. Obviously, we can't deal with that intimidation. What we certainly have said, and the latest guidance is clear on that, is you need to reflect on what the impact of your decision is, and that it will become increasingly unjustifiable to take action. So we've moved a bit towards, I think, what you're saying, because I'm not entirely clear whether you're saying we should be telling them, no, you can't do it. Well, we can't say that, because that's not. So we've moved a bit towards that. I think what the advice we have to give has to be proportionate to what we think is going on.
You could say best practice is not to go on strike.
I think what we have said, and I'll repeat it, is that it becomes increasingly unjustifiable to take industrial action where you see the kind of harm that we're already doing.
Good. Right. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask? Any comments they'd like to make? Yes. Fire. Yeah. I suggest that I'll come to you in a minute, Sally. Yeah.
Right. Talking about the strike, do you think that the doctors in training have irreparably damaged their professional status by taking this action, particularly withdrawing emergency cover?
I think it's very difficult, if you look at social history, to look at what damage this has done. I think it's doing enormous damage. I think it's doing enormous damage to the individuals themselves. It's obviously not great for the government, I guess, as well. On the longer term professionalism issue, I'm honestly not sure whether that actually will disappear over time. But I do worry about the levels, Roy's referred to it, the levels of disillusion, the levels of alienation, which, to be honest, I don't think are really around the contract. I think they're around a whole series of wider things, some of which we've touched on, which is the behaviour, dare I say it, of employers. It may be even the training system. We have overall responsibility for that. A lot of the solutions of the training system were solutions to problems of long hours, but the firm went, the sense of belonging to a team went. Doctors are now much more likely to be set a series of tasks. In some places, relationships between them and the nursing profession isn't as close and as good as it used to be. So what it means to be a doctor in training, in some circumstances, I'm not saying all, for some they still say it's the greatest job in the world, but for some I think it is becoming increasingly difficult. And I think that, you know, some of the stuff which probably doesn't cost an employer a ton of money, which is giving somebody a decent meal at night, making sure that they can probably meet with the other doctors in training on the shift. I suspect there are things that, well, I think we've all got to go a bit mea culpa about this. You know, I think it really needs some thought given to, here are a group of people. I don't like the term junior doctor because, and Roy's right, of course some of them are quite junior because they've just come out of medical school, but large numbers of them, and this is the problem, are called junior doctors. But actually they wouldn't, you know, if you were a kind of 33-year-old lawyer working in a firm in the city, you wouldn't be called a junior lawyer, would you? You would regard yourself as actually quite a senior lawyer. You might not be a partner in the firm yet. But we've got, I think we need to value these people. And actually, it may not just be doctors, so let's be clear about this. All the stuff suggests that if you value your staff, your patient care will get better. And I think, and I endorse what you say, there is too much evidence that the system at the moment is not valuing staff. They then become alienated, so you get this ridiculous divide between professions and management. And professional engagement, if you look at all the inquiries, clinical engagement was low in all the bad hospitals.
Exactly. Do you know, and just to follow on that, I spoke to a junior doctor, and it really brought it home to me. She said that she was on a 3 months, whatever it is, in the hospital before she moved. She's come to the end of it, and she got a child. Her husband was a doctor, and she couldn't get the rotas from the new hospital that she was going to. Therefore, she couldn't plan her childcare. Therefore, she didn't know what the hell's, you know. And I thought, you know what? I'd never thought about that.
No, it's useless. People are even saying, I had this the other week from a doctor in training who said that they were trying to go as I think she was going to be a bridesmaid or something at a wedding 6 months in advance, and she couldn't say yes. I mean, which of us professionals, or anybody actually, even if you're a shift worker, would not be able to say yes to somebody for an important, really important occasion? And that's indenturing people. It's not employing them.
Sally.
Just a comment, yes.
Yes, please.
The cosmetic guidance is going to make a difference because it's come from a regulator. It's all been said before. I think what we just need to make sure that it's for cosmetic non-injectables as well, non-surgery. And I hope some of the issues that are in it, like doctors in the sector tend to up their qualifications, and they're an experienced ENT surgeon in Scotland where they not even FRCS, and that is extremely concerning.
Why didn't the industry regulate itself? Why do you need to trouble Neil? You're all making a fortune. You could have set up an independent advisory panel. Some big knob could have chaired it, and you could have done this for yourself.
I don't think the industry is mature enough to do that.
Well, that's an interesting answer, isn't it?
To be told, but I hope the guidance is going to be shared with the GDC and the NMC, because the public don't just go to doctors for non-surgical cosmetics. So,
I was wondering where to get my Botox. So Neil, what's next for you? Because you're leaving the GMC. You're gonna pitch up somewhere else. You're like the bouncing ball.
Well, I thought writing a blog every week. Actually, I thought that would
You could do mine. It's easy.
I don't know, but I certainly will be looking for something else to do.
You will do something else?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll have done. I originally intended to do the GMC for 6 years. I decided to do 7. I think 7's a reasonable innings for this kind of role.
So what will it be? Journalism? Will it be running something, or have you had enough of running something?
I probably had enough of running. I don't want to commit myself on air here in my future career, but then people say, you said you weren't going to.
B&Q are hiring.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's probably the answer.
You know thoughts?
I haven't.
No, for the sense, not the job, the sense of direction.
Not really. I'm looking for opportunities.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's see what we can find for a young journalist who's made good. Hasn't that been an interesting evening? It's been fantastic. Neil, thank you so much. We've overrun horribly, but we do have a little tradition where we always like to say thank you to our guests. And I'm really looking forward to this because we like to give our guests a bottle of whiskey.
Thank you very much.
Now, the thing about this whiskey, Neil,
is it's Welsh.
It's Welsh. And I have to tell you that is the finest whiskey in the world.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll find that.
Well, thank you
and
very
if you were
much
thinking of writing a blog, well, that's what fuels most of mine. So you've been a wonderful guest and really entertaining. And we wish you luck with the rest of your career. And thank you so much. Thank you very much. So, that's it. You've been watching this on Proscope. Thank you very much. It's Lord Carter of Bogrole next week. And join us for that. Thank you very much.